everybody. This is Charles Lincoln from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm having problems with video, which I do not quite understand. Um, but anything, anything and everything that can go wrong always does here. They managed to make Wagner sound like graham crackers, and there's no video. I don't know. You don't get to see my beautiful face, which is of course a terrible loss to everybody. The video seems to be running. I hope that the I I hope that the sound is working. Uh, and I'm just telling the producer no video. Um, and anyhow, but today I wanted to talk about uh, things relating to Jewish influence in the South. It's a very sensitive issue, obviously, very important issue, and it's an issue that we're always kind of dancing around and skirting. And tonight, I just want to focus a little bit of attention on it because it's very, very worrisome. And, the way I would start is from a Black Lives Matter perspective, actually, and a deconstructive legal perspective. I hope everybody remembers that the official name of this series is Legal Realism, and legal realism is a doctrine came out of basically Harvard and Yale in the 1970s and 80s, especially associated with Duncan Kennedy and Larry Tribe. Duncan Kennedy is not Jewish, Larry Tribe is. But the point of legal realism is that law is politics, in a word. Law is politics and is basically ritualized politics. So I guess it isn't all that surprising that religion plays a huge role in determining people's affiliation in law, and I guess the best place to start might be in the 1850s and 60s with the Southern of slavery. Now, Sam Dixon, who's on the show frequently, he was on last night, he tells me that he's got a book which I've got to see, which is apparently a limited edition, 1860 Atlanta published, 1,000-page or more defense of slavery. And I haven't seen that book, obviously, and he says that it's too delicate to send in the mail, so I'll have to go visit him in Atlanta at some stage. But I happen to know because my mother actually turned me on to this when I was like 12. She told me that I had to learn the truth about the Civil War, and that the only way to learn the truth about Civil War was to read original documents from the era, and she particularly guided me to the Southern Defense of Slavery. And the Southern Defense of Slavery was economically motivated. There's no question about that. Slavery was a tremendously profitable institution in the Old South. Anyone who tells you that is just, anyone who tells you otherwise is just a fool. Slavery was not dying out in the South. Slavery was booming in the South in the 1850s. Almost all of the oldest houses in uptown New Orleans, which are still standing from the antebellum era, are from the 1840s and 50s. There might be a very few going back to the 1830s, but basically outside of the French Quarter, almost none, even as old as the 1820s. The 1850s saw a tremendous boom of construction, not only here in New Orleans, but also throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, East Texas, Galveston, Texas, for instance. And the reason is because the Cotton South was booming. And it was my grandmother, my mother's mother, always told me that the real reason for the Civil War was the intense envy of the North at Southern wealth, and that really it was the basically the envy of Southern prosperity and riches that drove the nation to war in 1860. Be that as it may, Jews had a very special status both here in New Orleans and throughout the South, really, at least New Orleans and Charleston, and also places like Galveston. But New Orleans was probably the most important, but definitely not the oldest Jewish center in the South. The oldest Jewish center in the South is, in fact, Charleston, South Carolina. The reason for that is not kind of interesting, it's actually very interesting. The reason for that is that the charter of South Carolina was written by none other than John Locke, sort of not a founding father, but a founding great grandfather, I guess, of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson relied heavily on John Locke in his writings, as did Madison and Adams, but particularly the famous formulation in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a direct paraphrase of life, liberty, of John Locke's Life, Liberty, and Property. Anyhow, John Locke was responsible for writing the charter, the original charter in 1670, King Charles II, of the Carolina colonies. And he wrote from the beginning that it needed to be a haven of religious freedom. I'm sure most of you are aware that Jews were banned, they were expelled from England from the reign of King Edward in the 1290s up through the reign of Queen Elizabeth and King James, officially, although Elizabeth and James in the 16th and 17th century did allow some Jewish immigration, but the complete expulsion of the Jews was basically not rescinded. It's never been rescinded officially, but as a practical matter, of course, it was abandoned in the 1650s, rather, the mid 17th century, by Oliver Cromwell. The Protestants were very friendly to the Jewish power, although yesterday I noticed that in 1524, the Pope had allowed a Jewish community to be established in Rome, 32 years after Columbus discovered America. All very interesting. But anyhow, Charleston was an anchor of Jewish settlement. Starting about 1800, Josiah Touro, son of Isaac Touro, came down from Rhode Island, where the Touro family was very, very big shipping and especially slave trading family. The Touro family played a huge role in the development of 19th century New Orleans. Josiah, among other things, hilariously or ironically enough, Josiah Touro, or was it Judah Touro? One of the major Touros sponsored lent the money basically to construct Christ Church Cathedral and Trinity Church, NOLA. In other words, the first Protestant churches were sponsored by Jewish money. That's an interesting précis for what we're about to talk about. In 1860, I was going to go back to the defense of slavery. One of the primary reasons, aside from economic benefit of slavery, that Southerners used in defense of slavery was biblical citation. Almost every argument that my mother ever had me read of the defense of slavery. I mean, remember that Darwin had just published, and he was not widely read. So the concept of blacks as the missing link, which was promoted by Thomas Huxley, one of Darwin's close friends, that idea had not caught on by 1860. Darwin had not even written The Descent of Man. He had written The Origin of Species. And so the idea of evolution was very new, and Darwinism was a nascent science. So none of that came into the Southern defense of slavery in any detailed way. There were people like the Vice President Alexander Stephens, obviously, who firmly believed that that there was a racial hierarchy and that whites were destined to rule over black people. But that was actually also based in large part on the early 19th, mid-19th century interpretation of the Bible, the Old Testament, obviously, in particular. And in connection with the Old Testament, of course, it's interesting to think about two U.S. senators who became Confederates. Lots of U.S. senators became Confederates, but two in particular are of interest here. One was Judah P. Benjamin of New Orleans, and the other was David Levy of Florida. David Levy of Florida has a county named after him on the Gulf Coast and a major historic site. Judah P. Benjamin has a chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans named after him. I believe it's the Tampa St. Pete chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans is the Judah P. Benjamin chapter. In any event, Jews were well accepted in the Confederate States of America. There's a major boulevard here. There's none named, well, there's a tiny street in it called Benjamin, uptown New Orleans, and there's a plaque by one of Judah P. Benjamin's houses just off St. Charles. But the biggest street named after a Jewish Confederate is the Adolph Meyer Boulevard on the West Bank. And Adolph Meyer was from Natchez, and he was obviously, well, he was a very wealthy person. After the war, he was in the U.S. Congress. But Judah P. Benjamin had a very special role, and Judah P. Benjamin was the first Confederate Attorney General. He was then the Confederate Secretary of War, and he finally wrapped up a brief and tumultuous 4-year career in Confederate service as the Confederate Secretary of State. He was one of those who stayed with Jefferson Davis almost to the end. He was involved in the evacuation of Richmond, and Judah P. Benjamin has been a very controversial character. Some people say that he absconded with the Confederate gold. I frankly doubt that very strongly, because he seems to have arrived in London after the war quite penniless and needing to start all over again. But he, strangely enough, of course, he hooked up with the Rothschild family and managed to make a second career in his life in London. But what I discovered today that inspired me to talk Oh, today is the second to last day of Hanukkah, by the way. I know that that's a very important day to all of you who are listening, and I just want you to think that this is the second to last candle that gets lit on the menorah. Tomorrow, Hanukkah ends tomorrow night at sunset. And so it's particularly appropriate to think about Jewish power on this, the ultimate day of Hanukkah. Uh, and and the strong Jewish presence in the Confederacy is one interesting feature, but I just found out something that I really should have known a long time ago. I'm always learning things that I didn't know before. I just discovered today that John Minor Wisdom belongs to the same Jewish family as Judah P. Benjamin. And this kind of blew my mind. Benjamin's family ranged from Charleston to the formerly British, well, still British West Indies, the British Virgin Islands to be specific, St. Thomas, I believe. Maybe that's part of the American Virgin Islands now. But I guess it was done. Was it technically Danish when he would have lived there? I know that we got the Virgin Islands from Denmark. Very few people realize that Denmark had a small colonial presence in the West Indies, but they did. In any event, John Minor Wisdom, for those of you who don't live in New Orleans, he gave his name to the United States courthouse for the Fifth Circuit. The big building on the riverside, the south side of Lafayette Square, just off St. Charles, well, actually just off Camp Street, is the John Minor Wisdom United States Federal Courthouse. And that's where the Fifth Circuit where the Fifth Circuit is headquartered. Fifth Circuit used to be the court for the Court of Appeals for the entire South. It used to be Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Around 1980, 81, 82, somewhere in there, they divided the Fifth Circuit into two halves, and they renamed the Georgia-centered Atlanta court, Georgia, Florida, Alabama. They renamed that the 11th Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit is still Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But basically, the Fifth Circuit courthouse in New Orleans was the battle place during the 1950s and 60s and 70s for all of the great desegregation controversies. And John Minor Wisdom was the Jewish judge who led the fight for integration in the South. Isn't that interesting? I'm sure that most people who are listening here are aware that it was not black people but Jews who founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And what I actually didn't know, I've been reading this article, The Legal, Political, and Religious Legacy of an Extended Jewish Family by Joel William Friedman in the Journal of Southern Jewish History. It's a fabulously interesting article, and I've really learned a lot that as I say, I feel like I should have known it for years, but I didn't know it until now. 5 of the 6 white lawyers who signed the NAACP brief in the preceding precedent-shattering school desegregation case, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, were Jews. I guess that's not too surprising, but I didn't actually know it. What The article goes on to say is what is less documented and less known, however, is the fact that one of the most pivotal and notable features in the racial integration of American society, United States Fifth Circuit Judge John Minor Wisdom was the descendant of an extended Southern Jewish family. From the era of the Civil War through the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, several prominent members of this family played leading roles in political and legal arenas. Others took the lead in establishing vibrant, don't you love that word, vibrant, vibrating Jewish communities in Charleston, New Orleans, and San Francisco. And their two most celebrated members, although the least connected to Judaism, emerged as unlikely champions of civil rights. This is that family's story. The lives and contributions of some members of this extended family, such as Judah P. Benjamin, are well known and extensively documented. Judah P. Benjamin, as I said, was basically Jefferson Davis's right-hand man in the Confederate States of America, and he's the only member of the Confederate family, of the Confederate cabinet, I should say, who moved to England after the war and could have basically acted as a revolutionary or at least an archivist and reservoir of independent, non-Yankee controlled Confederate history and propaganda, but instead he burned all his records. And this, of course, is the most suspicious thing that anyone could do. He had achieved this incredible level of prominence. He was only the second Jew to ever sit in the United States Senate. The first was David Yulee Levy of Florida. But Benjamin was the second, and he burned his papers as if he had something to hide. Or I also hypothesize that the Rothschilds told him he had bet on the wrong horse and that he needed to change his mind and turn away from feudalism, the feudalism of the South, to nascent socialism of Europe. In any event, John Minor Wisdom and Judah P. Benjamin are related, and this blew my mind because, of course, Judah P. Benjamin, in many ways, he is or should be a central figure in Southern Confederate pride and history. But maybe there is a certain opportunism in the Jewish extended family that simply negates any kind of real loyalty to the concept of Southern Anglo-Irish French heritage, which was the source of Southern identity and pride. In any event, this article goes on to say that Judah P. Benjamin totally assimilated, but others didn't. But John Minor Wisdom had played a truly unique role in beating down every legal and constitutional challenge to desegregation that was ever launched in the South. Without his dedicated and firm commitment to integration, segregation might have a chance to survive at least another 10 or 20 years in the South. And here's another thing I didn't know that I've learned today about John Minor Wisdom. Under whose presidency was Brown v. Board of Education decided? It was decided under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. What did they call Dwight D. Eisenhower at West Point? They called him the Little Jew. He always denied it. He always identified as Christian, but it seems very likely, based on a whole lot of things we know about him, that in fact he was at least morally and spiritually Jewish. Certainly, the way he treated the German people, the German soldiers, the German prisoners of war during the occupation, smacked of the 1933 declaration of war by Judea upon Germany. It is too interesting to think about John Minor Wisdom being the man who, at the 1952 Republican convention, actually guaranteed and secured the nomination of Dwight D. Eisenhower over Taft of Ohio. That is amazing, because Taft was one of those people listed by Kennedy in Profiles in Courage as a man who had stood up against, believe it or not, the vicious oppression of the Germans and the condemnation of the Germans in the immediate post-war era. Not many people had the guts to stand up that Nuremberg was a legal and political show trial, even though it was basically designed by Stalin. Just put a little Anglo-American bells and whistles on formalities of a true Russian show trial. But John Minor Wisdom was part of the cabal, if we call it that, that brought the Jewish cabal that brought Eisenhower to the presidency, and of course, immediately sponsored the. One of his first acts was to appoint former California governor, former California attorney general, who had been in charge of the Japanese concentration camps, by the way. Earl Warren. Governor Earl Warren became Chief Justice under Eisenhower, and basically the first item of his agenda was to perfect to help the litigants from the NAACP perfect the litigation of Brown v. Board and associated cases against the 1924 Democratic candidate for President, John Davis. That was his last case, basically, Brown v. Board. He had won a tremendous victory for the Constitution against Harry Truman in 1952. I love to talk about, at some stage, Youngstown Sheet and Tube v. Sawyer, in which Harry Truman's preemptive attempt at socialist nationalization of the steel industry during the Korean War, pretextually based on the Korean War, was soundly rejected by the Supreme Court. John Davis is a figure that's almost forgotten in American history today. His 30 to 40-year career in the service of the South and the Constitution should be remembered. But there's now this triangle between Eisenhower, John Minor Wisdom, and the Brown v. Board case, and of course, immediately once Eisenhower was in power, he wanted to reward John Minor Wisdom, and he also wanted to secure the Fifth Circuit against Southern resistance. Some of you may be familiar with the Southern Manifesto, which was written in the Senate, I believe, in either 56 or 57, against a Brown v. Board. And it was a brilliant constitutional statement signed by almost every Southern senator except for two. There were only two Southern senators who didn't sign on to the Southern Manifesto. One was Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. What a shock. And the other, a little bit more obscure, was Al Gore's dad from Tennessee. It's amazing, isn't it, how family links come through. Judah P. Benjamin to John Minor Wisdom to Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Gore and Johnson against the rest of the South. So I wanted to just talk for a minute about who John Minor Wisdom was and what was his role in New Orleans. Why was he a rich and prominent citizen of New Orleans? Even in order to have this influence, he delivered the state of Louisiana for Eisenhower in the '56 election. This was the first crack in John W. Davis's Solid South, the Solid South that had supported basically segregation and the New Deal, strange as the combination was, for 30 years. Went over to Eisenhower starting in 1956. The Eisenhower administration was an unmitigated disaster for the South. I assume most people listening know that. He not only appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court and supported the Brown v. Board litigation, but he also appointed all these judges throughout the United States, including John Minor Wisdom. 1957, he was appointed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where he served for the rest of his life until he died in 1999. And they named the courthouse after him in tribute to all his great contributions in subverting the South and transforming the South, lest we forget. And just the fact that I was going to talk about his background. His dad created Maison Blanche. Some of you who are familiar with New Orleans culture and history may recognize Maison Blanche as the second oldest major department store that used to exist on Canal Street. The oldest, of course, was D.H. Holmes, dating back to 1842. But Maison Blanche, founded around 1900, was founded by Isidore Newman and John Minor Wisdom's dad. Isidore Newman founded this Jewish school uptown on Jefferson Avenue, called the Isidore Newman School. It's a center of Jewish culture in New Orleans, close to the Jewish Community Center, also on Jefferson, and not so much Turo, but the other one called the synagogue right by Tulane. Its name is escaping me right now, but there's a big, very modern. Turo is a very old traditional synagogue, and I guess, is it Temple Sinai? It might be Temple Sinai, but I can't remember it. I walk by it all the time, but I can't remember it. It's right next to Roman Catholic Loyola College, oddly enough. But the Jewish presence in uptown New Orleans is tremendous. Newman and Wisdom were major figures in that cultural and political transformation of uptown New Orleans, including the sponsorship of the Zemurray family coming into New Orleans. Zemurray from Chisinau in Moldova. I knew a lady from Chisinau once. What was her name? Let's see. Orly Tights. Oh yes. But Samuel Zemurray from Chisinau established the United Fruit Company. So if you think about it, United Fruit Company was one of the great early 20th century institutions in New Orleans. The Maison Blanche department store, second most important in New Orleans, one of the most important in the South, and then the law. And Zemurray is very interesting because Zemurray, in particular, his daughter, Doris Zemurray Stone, transformed Tulane University, played a large role in the transformation of Tulane University. Also uptown, Tulane had started out, of course, under the will of Paul Tulane, one of the largest private financiers in support of the Confederate States of America. Paul Tulane had created the Tulane Endowment for the University of Louisiana when the University of Louisiana was basically bankrupt. Amusing story about Paul Tulane is that he was a Princeton graduate and he loved Princeton and he wanted to give his fortune to Princeton University, New Jersey. But his condition was that Princeton had to name itself after him, and they simply refused, even though their original name was College of New Jersey. Princeton's just a town. Anyhow, Princeton refused, and Paul Tulane, I've been to his grave, is buried on the south side of Princeton, New Jersey, with a statue of himself with his back to Princeton University, looking southwest towards New Orleans. Anyhow, but Paul Tulane had endowed the University of Louisiana to be the great university of the South, dedicated to the education of white Christian men. And the Zemurrays came in the early 20th century and basically bought up Tulane and had it gradually transform into what's now a nearly 40% Jewish population. It's basically a Jewish university. 40% is incredible. No other major university that I'm aware of has that high a percentage of Jews. But Tulane was transformed, and the transformation started taking place. They started admitting a large number of Jews in the 1950s. It had never been before that. And in the 1960s, basically the white supremacist control, the Tulane legacy was strong enough that Tulane, unique among the thousands of cases that went to the United States Supreme Court regarding school desegregation, Tulane won the right to remain a segregated institution because of Paul Tulane's will. And the lone dissenter in the Fifth Circuit from upholding the validity of Paul Tulane's will was, of course, John Minor Wisdom. Ultimately, the Supreme Court also upheld the validity of Paul Tulane's will, but the Jewish community and government of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon ultimately put pressure on Tulane by denying them government grants until such time as they officially integrated Black students. When I was at Tulane in the 1950s, I was a member of the very first fully integrated freshman class. It was pretty interesting, but they had started admitting a few token blacks. One of my professors, Sanford Etheridge, of classics, joked that the door was opened by the football team. They wanted they wanted black football players, but the role of the Turos and the Wisdoms and the Newmans in transforming New Orleans, and by extension of New Orleans, the entire South, is a very interesting issue. And I find it very difficult to understand how it is that the Jewish people, whose Old Testament was so universally cited as support for the institution of slavery, not segregation, but the institution of slavery in particular, and the supremacy of the white race. How did this group come to be the driving force in integration? Founded the NAACP, what was it, 1912, I guess, 1912 or 13. Throughout the 20s, Felix Frankfurter and Cardozo chipped away in the Supreme Court at various precedents. And starting after World War II, Jewish people joined en masse. Jewish lawyers, I should say, not Jewish people, but Jewish lawyers and politicians and money joined en masse to force desegregation. And I just have to ask you, why did this happen? Why is it important for a descendant of Judah P. Benjamin, or maybe not a direct descendant, but a member of the same family, a member of Judah P. Benjamin's family, one of the oldest Jewish families in the South, to become the apostle of integration, pushing Dwight Eisenhower to the presidency, pushing the Brown v. Board down the throats of 6 of the southern states. Remember, for all of Minor Wisdom's active career, 57 to 77, for that entire 20-year period, which was the big fight of integration. He stayed on as a senior judge until he died in 99, but his active period was that 2 decades, 57 to 77. And during that time, he was basically a dictator, putting pressure on other judges and coordinating the entire campaign against segregation in the South. And this was a disaster for the South. One of the least realized features of the civil rights movement is the degree to which it was a disaster for Black people as well. I had the privilege, almost 10 years ago now, a fellow up in New York who had been originally from Louisiana, and in fact he had transformed his Upper East Side New York apartment into a little mini New Orleans. Fabulous fellow by the name of Jeron Ames. His family had been the founder of the largest Black bank in the South. And I said, well, how could you ever leave the South with that kind of heritage? And he said, well, the Jews and the civil rights, they destroyed Black autonomy in the South. And this is where we kind of come around full circle. I said I was going to give a Black Lives Matter perspective on all of this. Blacks used to have banks in the South that would lend to the segregated Black areas, and they specialized in promoting Black home ownership. And this was abolished by integration on the one hand and federal nationalization, basically, of the banking industry. When I first came to the United States I was born in the United States, I should say, but when I first came back to the United States to go to school in Dallas in the 1960s, there were laws that prohibited interstate banking. Did you know that? You couldn't, the First National Bank of Dallas could not do business the Republic Bank. There were two big banks in Dallas. I went to school with the kids of both of their owners. Jimmy Aston was the son of a Republic Bank owner, president, and they could not open a branch in Oklahoma or Louisiana. That's hard to believe now, isn't it? Where we've got Chase and Bank of America and Wells Fargo all across the country. Nationwide bank was the predecessor to international banking, becoming the international finance system. But the point is that it was this group of people who did that. They undermined the local black banks and segregation, which was protecting black communities and black families. Last night, Sam Dixon commented that in the year that Brown v. Board of Education was decided, 1954, less than 25% of all black children were born outside of wedlock, illegitimate. But in the modern era, it's close to 70 or 80% of black children are born outside of wedlock, and close to or over 50% of white children are born outside of wedlock. In understanding this, I think it's necessary to go back again to the real nature of the American Civil War, conflict between the feudalism of the South and the nascent socialism of the world. In February of 1848, the Communist Manifesto was published in London, originally published in German, but was rapidly translated into English and became a major, and French, and it became the source of the revolutions all over Europe, known as the revolutions of the 48. This was a major contributing factor, which our history books do not teach us about the real and true origins of the American Civil War. The American Civil War was the first great continental war. It was basically a predecessor to World War I and World War II, and those three wars should always be taught and remembered in history as a triad of wars. The American Civil War, World War I, and World War II, they were Marxist-inspired wars of social transformation aimed at destroying the best elements of Western civilization and reducing them to ruins. Again, I remember from my own high school education, the comparisons of the ruins of Atlanta and Richmond in 1865 with Berlin and Hamburg and Nuremberg in 1945. The way of Marxist war is to destroy a nation completely, the southern United States, all of Germany, and taking out quite a bit of France and Italy in the process, possibly almost all of Poland. The tragedy of these wars is not disconnected from the rise of Jewish power. I don't know exactly how to explain it. I don't know why it happened, but the Jews were effectively emancipated under Napoleon 50 years before the American Civil War. Jews had not been even though in England they had been allowed since at least the time of Cromwell. In England and Holland, they had been forming banking institutions. The Rothschilds formed their bank in their Red Shield Bank in Frankfurt in, I believe, 1758. But these were very small institutions until the Napoleonic Wars. And in the Napoleonic Wars, they exploded and became major forces in political power. I do not, I know that the nature of the banking system was a major factor in the formation of the American Civil War. The southern states were very protective of state regulation of banking against a national system of regulation of banking. Abraham Lincoln was very strongly in support of the national regulation of banking. But starting with, I mean, did Judah P. Benjamin have anything to do with the collapse of the Confederacy? I mean, I know that some people think so, that he was like some sort of mole. It's hard for me to believe Jefferson Davis would have had such bad judgment as to have an actual mole as his top advisor in his cabinet. So my preferred theory is that Judah P. Benjamin was a sincere assimilationist. He did not want the Jews to remain separate until after the collapse of the Confederacy, when he basically had to turn to the Rothschilds to help him rebuild his life. Samuel Zemurray, the founder of the United Fruit Company, Isidore Newman, founder of Maison Blanche, the Wisdom family, all apparently related, and all certainly cooperative in the reconstruction of New Orleans as basically a largely Jewish city, a Jewish city that is the leader in promotion of black and white miscegenation. This is the tragedy of modern America, and it's a tremendous coincidence. But we need to learn our history more. We need to understand the role of people like John Minor Wisdom in the election of Eisenhower, and the election of Eisenhower in the appointment of Earl Warren, and the appointment of Earl Warren with the passage of Brown v. Board of, well, the resolution, I guess, which is a decision, so-called judicial decision in Brown v. Board of Education, and then John Minor Wisdom's implementation of integration throughout the South. These are little avenues of history that we need to know more and more about. Sam Dixon has opened my eyes to the possibility of Felix Frankfurter as the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, as his possible role and identity as one of the top Soviet Bolshevik agents in the teens and 1920s. We all know that American banking industry basically created the Soviet Union of nothing. In other words, in the Jewish admission of the admission of Jews into the capitalist world, we created communism, and in communism, we destroyed Western civilization. I don't know whether the deracinization of the South or the so-called denazification of Germany is ultimately more significant. They are obviously both parallel processes, and they both trace, without any doubt or exception, to certain elite Jewish families which have taken an inordinate amount of control over the politics and cultural transformation, economic transformation. Think of the destruction of black banks that only exist in a segregated South and could only guarantee black home ownership in a segregated South. And when you guarantee home ownership, of course, you're guaranteeing the economic cohesion of the family. And so basically, Jewish power has also played a major role in making black people poor. And as we're closing, I just want to mention the significance of the John Minor Wisdom Courthouse. I guess I'll have to talk later about how Black Lives Matter say that blacks shouldn't have to walk by courthouses with Confederate statues and monuments in front of them because that shows too much prejudice. We're out of time, folks. I need to continue this conversation later. Good evening to you all from New Orleans, Louisiana. Just a few blocks from the John Minor Wisdom Courthouse. Der fliegenden Holländer nennt man mich. Befragt die Meer in aller Zonen. Befragt den Seemann den Ozean durchspricht.